guys, I'm Miss Christina, and I'm so glad you joined me for our Bible lesson today. I've wrangled in my boys to help me, Parker and Nate, and I've got a building challenge for them. You each have the same amount of Play-Doh and 30 toothpicks. The challenge is simple. You have 2 minutes to see who can build the tallest freestanding tower. Okay, do you guys have your strategy down? Nate, what's your strategy?
Build balls out of Play-Doh.
Okay, Parker, what's your strategy?
Bigger base equals bigger tower.
Okay, guys, who do you think's gonna win? Who thinks Nate's gonna win? Who thinks Parker's gonna win? Okay, I'm gonna have you build while I introduce our story. On your marks, get set, go. You have 2 minutes. Today our story is about God's people's return to the land God had given them. Not only did they return, but they also set out to rebuild the destroyed temple. That's where our building challenge comes in, because they're rebuilding the temple. Do you remember what the temple is? Yes, it's the building where God's physical presence would come and meet with the high priest. Then the priest would give the message back to the people. Looking good, guys, looking good. Let's remember our big picture question. How is Jesus the perfect prophet? Say it with me. Jesus perfectly reveals God the Father and fulfills what the prophets spoke. That means that Jesus' words, thoughts, and actions were exactly in line with what God the Father wanted. Because Jesus is God the Son, he has all power and authority. Every prophecy in the Old Testament led to Jesus, and all God's promises will come true in Jesus. The Old Testament prophet Jeremiah told God's people that because they would repeatedly disobey God, they would be sent into exile. That's what we learned last month. Exile is when someone's forced to leave his or her own country and move somewhere else. And God's people were sent into exile into Babylon. The stories about Daniel in the lion's den, the 3 friends being saved from the fiery furnace, all happened in Babylon during the exile. Jeremiah also prophesied that the exile would only last for 70 years. And at the end of those 70 years, it was finally time for God's people to return to their homeland. And time. Hands up. Oh my goodness, Parker. You're barely on the verge of standing. Parker is our winner. Shake hands, guys.
Okay.
Good game.
Done.
Who would you like to thank for getting you here? Oh, love it. Okay. For any building to stand tall and strong, it needed a good foundation. That was your strategy, right?
Mine would have fallen down.
You think so? Maybe we can try again. Let's watch our story though and see how the Israelites rebuilt their temple.
Many years before God's people were taken to Babylon, God promised the prophet Jeremiah that the exile would last 70 years. Then, God would bring his people back home. God always keeps his promises. Cyrus, king of Persia, had taken over Babylon. God gave Cyrus an idea. Cyrus said, "Let all of God's people go back to Jerusalem so they can rebuild the Lord's temple. Give them gold and silver and animals. Give them gifts for God's temple." The exile was over. God's people were free to go back to their homes. God's people got ready and their neighbors gave them gifts: silver, gold, and animals and other expensive things. Zerubbabel and the high priest led God's people back to Judah. They had been away for 70 years. Many of the people were born in Babylon. They had never seen the land God had given their parents and grandparents. In all, thousands of people went back to Judah. They settled in their hometowns and set up their houses. Then the people met together in Jerusalem to rebuild the Lord's temple. First, the priests rebuilt the altar in the same place it used to be. They followed all the laws of God for building. When the altar was finished, they offered burnt offerings to God. The people also obeyed the law about special celebrations. They had a festival like God had told them to do, and they made sacrifices to God. Then God's people gave money to stonecutters and carpenters who would work on God's temple. They paid people to bring cedar logs to Jerusalem. Finally, when everything was ready, the people started to work. They laid the foundation of the temple. The foundation was important. It would make the building strong. When the foundation was finished, the priests put on special clothes and the people praised God. They sang, "The Lord is good. His faithful love will last forever." Then the people shouted and praised God. They were so happy. The foundation of the temple was complete. Not everyone was happy, though. Some of the older people remembered what the temple had looked like 70 years ago, before it had been destroyed. They cried. The noise of the crying and shouting was so loud that the people could be heard far away. Zerubbabel led God's people back to the temple to rebuild it. The temple was the place where God met with his people on earth. Jesus came to earth to rescue God's people. One day, Jesus will return to restore a greater home for all of God's people, and we will spend eternity with him.
God's people had gone through some pretty tough times during their exile in Babylon. Do you think God had forgotten about them? No way. God never stopped loving his children. They were his chosen people, and he had long ago promised that he would never abandon them. In fact, God had been using their time in exile to glorify himself and bless the world. Many kings and people who did not know God saw firsthand his power and love for his people. God had told his people through prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah that the exile would not last forever. And when God makes a promise, you can believe that he will always keep it. God kept his promise to bring his people home. The Bible tells us that the Lord aroused the spirit of King Cyrus to allow the people to return to Israel. Clearly, God was at work to bring his people home. Our God is in total control. He knows all things and has the power to make anything happen that he wants. King Cyrus even demanded that the people of Babylon give silver, gold, livestock, and other valuables to the Israelites. And as a result, they had the money and materials they needed to begin rebuilding the temple and their homes. God provides for his people always, and sometimes he provides in surprising ways. During their time in exile, the people may have felt hopeless. Over time, they may have wondered if God had forgotten about them, or if God was really going to keep his promise, but God's plan for his people was bigger than they knew. Zerubbabel led God's people back to the temple to rebuild it. The temple was the place where God met with his people on earth, and Jesus came later to earth to rescue God's people. One day, Jesus will return again to restore a greater home for all of God's people, and we will spend eternity with him. So let's close by saying our memory verse together for the month of May. Jeremiah 29:11. "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a hope and a future." Thanks, guys, and see you next week.